I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen being there.
What if the Queen's real will was never meant for the public? Buried in silence, it wasn't just a document, it was a royal detonation waiting to explode. For months after Queen Elizabeth II's death, the United Kingdom mourned a monarch who had ruled through wars, scandals, and seismic cultural shifts. Her passing marked the end of an era, but it was also supposed to usher in a period of stability. The will was read. The palaces stayed quiet. On the surface, everything unfolded with the polished grace expected of the monarchy. Official documents, released with elegant vagueness, showed her estate had been respectfully divided. Properties and heirlooms were accounted for. Camilla, the Queen Consort, was poised to step into her new symbolic role. And the public, though, curious, moved on believing the story had closed as neatly as it had begun. But inside the palace, a different story began to take shape. Whispers started behind velvet doors. Couriers overheard scraps of furious conversation. One aide noticed that a prized tiara had vanished from its catalogued location. And then came the questions, the sudden legal meetings, the quiet reassignment of senior staff, the late-night visits from lawyers. Something wasn't right. And for those closest to the late Queen, the signs were undeniable. Because, according to multiple high-level sources, those who had been part of the Queen's most trusted inner circle, there existed a second will, a will not filed with public record, a will not written for diplomacy or ceremonial tradition. This document was crafted in private, signed in secrecy, and intended to speak the Queen's truth when she no longer could. And that truth? It didn't name Camilla. It didn't leave her the jewels long assumed to be hers. In fact, it barely mentioned her at all. Instead, the Queen's personal inheritance, her prized possessions, letters, even a secluded royal residence were handed directly to Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Not Charles, not Anne, not Camilla. Catherine, the woman the Queen had chosen, not for optics, but for legacy. What followed inside the palace was nothing short of a controlled panic. Legal teams were brought in under strict confidentiality. Non-disclosure. Agreements were tightened to suffocating levels. Some staff were reassigned without explanation. But the damage had already been done. Because even behind gilded walls, the truth has a way of leaking out. And once it did, the ripple effects were seismic. This wasn't about inheritance. This wasn't about material wealth. It was about message. The Queen, with one final stroke of her pen, had bypassed the expected and chosen the meaningful. She had rejected the public image of a united royal front, and instead redefined it silently, powerfully, permanently. It was a rebuke wrapped in velvet, a royal reshaping disguised as a final act of love. But to understand why the Queen would do this, we must go back to the relationship that shaped this unprecedented choice. She wasn't just the Queen's granddaughter-in-law. She became her silent protege, chosen not with ceremony, but with trust. Catherine Middleton didn't walk into royalty with demands or expectations. She arrived with quiet dignity, the kind that spoke volumes in a world obsessed with image. In a palace still reeling from past betrayals and tabloid warfare, her presence felt like a calm the monarchy didn't realize it desperately needed. Queen Elizabeth II, a monarch hardened by decades of scandal, spectacle, and shattered expectations, noticed her immediately not for her style, not for her lineage, but for her silence. Unlike so many who entered the royal fold with flashes of fame and whispers of ambition, Catherine stood apart. She was composed, measured, private. And in that rare restraint, the Queen saw a mirror of herself. It began with brief encounters, a polite curtsy, a quiet word. But slowly, something deeper formed. The Queen began requesting Catherine's presence at more intimate gatherings, moments where senior royals traditionally dominated the conversation. It was there, away from public eyes, that the bond began to take root. The Queen, known for her aloofness and carefully controlled emotions, started to offer guidance. Nothing performative, no staged mentorships, just soft-spoken words passed during tea, handwritten notes left discreetly, nods of approval few others noticed. One courtier later recalled that after just their second private meeting, the queen turned to her aide and said, "She understands this life." For a woman who had buried emotion beneath duty for 70 years, that was a declaration. Catherine had what others lacked, an understanding of sacrifice, without complaint. When the tabloids circled, she didn't fight fire with fire. When critics speculated, she let silence speak. And the queen, who had watched Diana crumble under pressure, who had weathered Meghan and Harry's seismic departure, saw something in Catherine she hadn't seen in years. Someone who could endure the crown without letting it consume her. And time, the mentorship deepened. There were letters rumored to be filled with advice, warnings, encouragements. Some say one was written after Charlotte's birth, praising Catherine's strength as a mother and hinting at a future only the Queen would see. It wasn't just a bond between women. It was the careful shaping of a successor. There were gifts too, though never spoken of publicly. On Catherine and William's 10th wedding anniversary, it's said the Queen quietly gifted her a brooch that once belonged to Queen Mary, a piece untouched by Camilla, by Anne, by anyone else. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a symbol, a subtle confirmation that Catherine wasn't just accepted into the firm, she was being positioned for something more. Through these acts, the Queen began handing Catherine a legacy that couldn't be declared at press conferences or inscribed on official titles. It was an inheritance of trust, of belief, of the weight that came with invisible power. As their bond strengthened, so did the Queen's resolve. In an institution where loyalty is currency and discretion is gold, Catherine had proven herself worthy of both. And slowly, piece by piece, Queen Elizabeth began handing over what mattered most, not her throne, but her confidence. The kind of confidence that could outlast crowns, ceremonies, and even bloodlines. But where there was affection and trust on one side, there was distance and suspicion on the other. Behind palace smiles hid a rift decades in the making. Camilla wore the title, but never wore the Queen's approval. From the moment Camilla entered the royal frame, her presence stirred discomfort behind the gilded walls. While Queen Elizabeth II maintained outward composure, appearing gracious, composed, and diplomatic, the truth was far colder, far more calculating. Privately, she remained distant, her approval never freely given. She had lived through public scorn, managed national crises, and watched her family's image crumble more than once. The scars left by Diana's ordeal weren't just public relations. Disasters, they were personal, and they never truly healed. And then came Camilla, the woman many blamed for that fracture, stepping into the role once reserved for innocence, for reverence, for moral clarity. The Queen tolerated her, yes, but she never embraced her. To the public, their dynamic appeared cordial. Camilla was present at state functions, included in ceremonial roles, and even referenced in the occasional speech. But those who operated within the Queen's inner sanctum knew better. The warmth was missing. The trust never bloomed. Even as Camilla climbed through the ranks from Mistress to Duchess of Cornwall, and eventually to Queen Consort, the Queen's posture remained stiff, politely restrained, diplomatically cold. And while the monarchy rolled out the red carpet for Camilla's new title, Elizabeth quietly withheld something far more powerful: endorsement. What many fail to realize is that in the royal world, it's not the headlines that matter. It's the subtle handshakes, the whispered nods, the jewels that change hands not through public ceremony, but through private meaning. Camilla received none of these. She was never offered Queen Mary's brooch. She was never the recipient of handwritten notes laced with wisdom. She never heard Elizabeth call her a woman for the crown's future, because that future, in the Queen's eyes, was being shaped somewhere else, quietly, discreetly, and entirely out of Camilla's reach. Elizabeth didn't just view Camilla as controversial, she viewed her as a threat to the monarchy's moral foundation. The affair, the scandal, the pain etched into Diana's legacy, it all lingered. And Camilla's rise was seen as a wound never properly healed. The Queen, who believed in duty above all, believed the crown had taken a hit it might never fully recover from. Accepting Camilla publicly was a matter of necessity. Privately, she saw her not as a steward of the monarchy's values, but as a symbol of compromise, of a standard that had been lowered, not upheld. While Camilla positioned herself within the firm, learning protocol, attending state dinners, and curating an image of controlled respectability, the Queen was already turning her attention elsewhere. To Catherine. To the woman she believed could restore what had been lost, not just dignity, but integrity. Where Camilla represented the monarchy's past missteps, Kate embodied the promise of renewal. And as the Queen looked toward the future, her mind was no longer focused on who wore the crown today, but who deserved it tomorrow. And when the Queen prepared her final statement, she didn't choose words, she chose action. The world saw tiaras and estates, but what the Queen left behind was far more dangerous. A silent shift in power. Long before the vaults were opened and the cameras turned away, Queen Elizabeth II had already made her final move. It wasn't carved into a public address or spoken from a balcony. It didn't need to be. Because her most consequential decision wasn't made in front of the world, it was sealed quietly, deep within palace walls, in the form of a secret will. According to those close to the late monarch, this document held not just sentimental choices, but a declaration, a deeply personal realignment of the royal future that stunned even the most seasoned insiders. The contents? Nothing short of seismic. From the Queen Mother's treasured sapphire brooches to Queen Mary's rarely seen diamond pieces, heirlooms once presumed destined for Camilla were instead named for Catherine, the Princess of Wales. But the jewels were only the beginning. In that same confidential testament, Elizabeth bequeathed the Sandringham Summer Villa, not to Charles, not to Anne, but directly to William and Kate. It was a bold and deliberate deviation from royal expectation. For centuries, that estate had symbolized continuity of power. Now, it had been assigned to the next generation not through the crown, but through trust. Then came the most unexpected gift of all, a collection of handwritten letters and private diaries penned by Elizabeth herself across the span of decades. These weren't political dispatches or constitutional memos. These were her thoughts, her fears, her legacy, and they weren't left to her son, the reigning king. They weren't passed to her daughter, the stalwart Princess Royal. They were given unquestionably and completely to Catherine. To those in the Queen's circle, that single act spoke louder than any coronation ever could. It wasn't just inheritance, it was anointing. Camilla's name, by contrast, was nearly absent, not a mention alongside the jewelry. No inclusion in the estate's most sacred private properties, not even a gesture in the personal keepsakes. The omission was deafening. It wasn't an oversight, it was a message. Because in the House of Windsor, where titles are granted but loyalty is earned, silence can be more devastating than denial. Those who were briefed, Charles, Anne, and a handful of aides recognized instantly what it meant. The Queen hadn't simply dispersed possessions. She had redrawn lines of symbolic succession. Her actions revealed a startling reality. Camilla may wear the title of Queen Consort, but it was Catherine who had been chosen in spirit. Catherine, who had been entrusted with the relics that represented continuity, stability, and sovereign wisdom. The Queen had made her decision without fanfare, and the weight of that decision began rippling through the firm like a quiet earthquake. This wasn't just a distribution of property, it was a power shift, a redefinition of the monarchy's moral center. Elizabeth had taken the future into her own hands one last time, bypassing politics and protocol, and placing her faith in a woman who had never asked for it. But trust in the royal family isn't given lightly. And for Camilla, who had clawed her way to respectability, it was the ultimate betrayal. And when Camilla finally learned the truth, what followed was a royal explosion. When truth shattered royal illusion, Camilla didn't just react, she erupted, and no one inside Clarence House was ready for it. The revelation came not with ceremony, but in the quiet confines of a private study. Charles, ever the mediator, had hoped to cushion the blow. But there was no way to soften what had already been written in ink by a woman now beyond reach. The Queen's secret will had left Camilla out not just of jewels, not just of estates, but of legacy. And in a family that thrives on symbolism, that exclusion carried more weight than any crown. Charles sat her down and told her the truth, likely believing that his measured tone would keep things from spiraling. But what followed was unlike anything the palace had ever seen. Camilla's reaction was instant and unfiltered. The composed, calculated Queen Consort dissolved into a storm of fury. The first sound wasn't words, it was a scream. A raw, guttural cry that echoed through Clarence's house like a siren. Staff paused mid-step, glancing at each other with alarm. Behind the heavy doors, chaos had detonated. She shouted at Charles, not just in anger, but in betrayal. "You let her do this to me," she allegedly roared. "You knew." She accused him of cowardice, of standing by while Elizabeth's final insult was orchestrated. The betrayal, in Ififan, her eyes, wasn't just from the dead queen. It was from the man she had defended, the man who had promised her a seat at the top of the monarchy. Then came the destruction. A crystal glass shattered against the wall. Furniture was overturned. Portraits were nearly torn from the walls. One shaken aide would later whisper that it was the most terrifying outburst I've ever seen inside this house. Camilla didn't care who heard. In that moment, she wasn't a queen. She was a woman unraveling under the weight of rejection she thought she had long outlived. All the work, all the scrutiny, all the nights spent winning over the public, only to be dismissed in silence by the one woman whose approval she'd never truly won. The outburst continued for nearly an hour. Aides were ordered to stay away. Phones were temporarily confiscated. The press was fed a cover story. Camilla was unwell, resting from a cold. But within the palace, the story was very different. Staff walked on eggshells. Charles, visibly shaken, withdrew into silence. He had witnessed Camilla's temper before, but this was something else. This wasn't irritation. This was devastation. Not because of what was taken, but because of what was never offered. A will could be rewritten, but love, trust, and recognition from the monarch herself? That was gone. And it had never truly existed for her. But this wasn't just a personal meltdown. Camilla wanted revenge, and she went looking for it. Within 48 hours, the monarchy launched its oldest defense, denial. But not even the firm could contain what was already unraveling. The Queen's secret will had ignited a crisis that could not be swept beneath the palace carpets. And in the hallowed halls of Buckingham, where every whisper is measured and every move is calculated, panic spread fast. Emergency meetings were convened in total secrecy. No agendas, no aides, no recordings. Just the most senior figures of the royal apparatus, gathered behind locked doors with one shared mission: contain the fallout. The will existed. It had been executed. And worst of all, too many people already knew. The time for diplomacy was over. This was damage control. Non-disclosure agreements, some older than a decade, were swiftly updated with sharper claws. Staff were shuffled. Legal counsels who had once handled the Queen's private matters vanished from public view. One, it was said, was relocated to a discreet legal post abroad. Documents that had passed quietly through Windsor's corridors were buried, some allegedly destroyed. Phones were confiscated, security was heightened, and palace communication protocols were tightened to wartime standards. And yet, none of it was enough. The truth had been spoken aloud, and now it was living, growing, mutating, threatening to consume the image of unity that had barely survived the last decade. Camilla, still seething from the Queen's cold dismissal, demanded a legal path forward. Could it be contested? Overturned? Rewritten? But the answer, even for the Queen Consort, was no. The will, they told her, had been executed flawlessly. Every step legally protected, every clause ironclad. Because Elizabeth knew what was coming. She had planned for the resistance. What Camilla saw as betrayal, the Queen had calculated as legacy. And for Camilla, the denial only deepened the wound. She wasn't just excluded, she was powerless to undo it. Charles, meanwhile, became a shadow. His voice, once central, once authoritative, faded into hesitancy. He avoided confrontation with Camilla, dodged internal inquiries, and began withdrawing from direct involvement. Some say it was exhaustion. Others believe it was guilt. But the truth may have been simpler. He was caught between the last will of a monarch and the fury of the woman beside him. His silence was not neutrality, it was paralysis. Even Princess Anne, a woman known for her stoicism and disdain for palace theatrics, couldn't hide her discomfort. Those close to her say she had seen the Queen's secret will before the funeral and accepted its contents as personal and sacred, but the palace's sudden effort to bury it? That was different. Anne valued truth, not theater. And for the first time in decades, she was said to be visibly shaken by the dishonesty swirling around her family. The monarchy, so skilled in the art of silence, had found itself in a war it couldn't win with tradition. This wasn't just about wealth or titles anymore. It was about meaning, symbolism, a final royal act that refused to be silenced. As Clarence House spiraled into damage control, all eyes turned toward the woman at the center of it all, Catherine. She never wanted the crown, but the Queen handed her something more powerful: legacy. For Catherine, the revelation didn't come with a royal trumpet or a public announcement. It came in a sealed envelope passed quietly from William's hands to hers. Inside, a handwritten letter, its words unmistakably Elizabeth's. It was simple, it was tender, and it was devastating. In those lines, the late Queen expressed admiration, trust, and belief in a future Catherine had never claimed for herself. She praised her restraint, her composure, her loyalty to both family and institution. But more than anything, the Queen revealed the truth. Catherine wasn't simply respected. She was chosen, not as the next sovereign, but as the guardian of the monarchy's very soul. The moment shattered her, not with joy, but with the crushing weight of responsibility. According to a longtime aide, Kate cried for hours, not from pride, but from the realization that she was now at the center of something she never pursued. She had been content with quiet duty, supporting her husband, raising her children, and navigating the palace minefield without spectacle. But now, she had become the fulcrum of a silent war. A war she hadn't started, but could no longer avoid. Inside the palace, the shift was immediate. Though no statement had been issued and no title officially changed, the air around her thickened. She wasn't just the Duchess anymore. She was the woman who had received the Queen's final trust. The one Camilla had been excluded from. The one the aides whispered about with reverence, not rank. And that reverence came at a cost. Catherine became a lightning rod. Every sidelong glance, every shift in protocol, every private briefing she received drew attention. Staff were divided. Some admired her grace under pressure. Others resented her quiet rise. But none dared deny what had become increasingly clear. Catherine now carried the Queen's unspoken will, and yet she said nothing. There were no interviews, no strategic leaks, no staged appearances. She simply disappeared from the public eye for a time, retreating behind palace gates, leaning on William in private, and absorbing the magnitude of what had been passed to her. It was that silence, that refusal to fuel the fire, that deepened the symbolism. Because unlike the chaos erupting from Clarence House, Catherine responded not with outrage, but with restraint. And in the monarchy, that speaks louder than rage. But while she maintained silence, her world was changing rapidly. Meetings she once merely attended, she now led. Initiatives previously fronted by Camilla were reassigned. Commonwealth briefings, humanitarian planning, and even early succession strategy discussions, Catherine was being looped into it all. Quietly, purposefully, unofficially. And the more she accepted, the more the burden grew. Not just the burden of duty, but the burden of being the Queen's final choice in a family still tearing at the seams. And while Kate remained silent, the public began to speak for her. She didn't take the throne, but the people placed her on, and the palace could feel it. The monarchy didn't make an announcement. There was no official statement, no acknowledgement of a shift. But something had changed, and everyone could feel it, especially the public. Catherine, the woman who had quietly carried herself through scandal, grief, and rising expectations, now stood beneath the weight of a nation's reverence. Her silence was no longer just composure. It was power. And in that power, people saw something they hadn't felt since Queen Elizabeth's reign. Trust, almost overnight. Support for Kate surged. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't orchestrated it. But the public response was swift and fierce. Social media flooded with images of her standing beside the late queen, with captions not crafted by press teams, but by ordinary citizens. She didn't ask to be queen, but she already is. That sentiment echoed across timelines, news feeds, and headlines. For a monarchy struggling to maintain relevance, Catherine had become its beating heart without ever uttering a word. While Clarence House tried to suppress the fallout, a different kind of power was emerging at Kensington Palace. Royal engagements began to tell a different story. Events that once revolved around Camilla were now subtly redirected. Briefings, once reserved for the Queen Consort, were rerouted to Catherine. The shift wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Palace aides, once hesitant to place too much responsibility on the Princess of Wales, now began preparing her for something more. Commonwealth matters, humanitarian leadership, global diplomacy. The kind of training usually reserved for queens-in-waiting had now become part of her daily world. The contrast could not have been more stark. While Catherine's influence expanded, Camilla's public presence shrank. Once a central figure, Camilla now appeared less frequently. Her engagements scaled back, her appearances carefully managed. Inside the firm, it was clear. The Queen's final will hadn't just distributed heirlooms, it had redirected the monarchy's future, and the public had followed that signal without hesitation. Camilla had the title, but it was Catherine who had the people's confidence. And that confidence only grew. Her image, untouched by scandal, strengthened by restraint, began to resemble the late Queen's more than anyone else's. While others played politics or courted attention, Catherine had built something far rarer: quiet authority. She didn't posture. She didn't retaliate. She simply continued to show up, steady and poised, no matter what chaos swirled around her. And, in doing so, she became the figure people looked to in a time of uncertainty. Not because she was crowned, but because she was constant. But no matter how the palace tried to control the narrative, the Queen's message had already changed everything. The Queen didn't need a press release. Her final move was handwritten, eternal, and impossible to undo. Queen Elizabeth II, a monarch shaped by duty and defined by discipline, had always understood the power of silence, and in her final act, she used that silence like a sword piercing through protocol and reshaping the future of the crown without a single public word. Her will wasn't a legal formality. It was a message, not about possessions, but principles. Not about heirs, but character. She didn't name the next queen. She didn't have to. She simply passed down the things that mattered most, not to those with the highest rank, but to the one who had earned her faith through conduct, not claim. In that choice, Elizabeth dismantled centuries of expectation and replaced it with something more enduring, a new standard. She saw in Catherine the very strength that had once carried her through wartime Britain, through political upheaval, through family collapse and scandal. Composure, consistency, compassion, traits that couldn't be measured by lineage, only by resolve. And while the world debated titles and ceremonies, the Queen cut through it all with a legacy written in loyalty. She entrusted her private letters, her personal heirlooms, and even her emotional inheritance to Kate. That wasn't strategy, it was conviction. Because Elizabeth understood something many within her own circle refused to acknowledge: duty isn't defined by blood alone. It's defined by sacrifice. Camilla's absence from the Queen's private decisions wasn't a technicality. It was deliberate. In the wake of Elizabeth's passing, she became more visible in name than in presence. One by one, major events where her role had once seemed certain began to quietly shift. Appearances were cancelled, speeches reassigned, symbolism stripped away. The crown she wore now felt borrowed, held in place by custom, not connection. For a woman who had fought so long to be seen, Camilla was now fading from view. And no matter how many palace aides restructured her schedule, the absence was too loud to ignore. Meanwhile, Catherine's presence grew not with spectacle, but with weight. She didn't seize power, she absorbed it. Every step she took echoed the Queen's path, not through imitation, but intuition. Where others faltered under pressure, Catherine endured. Where others demanded attention, she deflected it. The monarchy's Future, once precariously balanced between tradition and reinvention, now found quiet stability in the very woman no one saw coming. It wasn't a coronation. It was a coronation of spirit unspoken, but undeniable. The Queen's final act wasn't a grand gesture. It was an intimate decision made in solitude, whispered through inheritance, etched into the structure of the firm in ways only insiders could fully grasp. It didn't make headlines. It didn't need to. Because it wasn't meant to shock the world, it was meant to guide it. And in doing so, she didn't just name a successor. She named a legacy. There was no public declaration, just a final, handwritten gesture, from one queen to the next. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.